Thank you very much for this invitation to celebrate and muse on the Guide to Studying the Visual Arts in Canada. The organizers of today's session invited speakers to reflect on art history in this publication, as well as to project possible futures. I will try to do both briefly, beginning by acknowledging one massive and positive change in art history, the growing, if long overdue, awareness and acknowledgement of an Indigenous presence. I believe that a land acknowledgement is in part a recognition of landscape as well as of peoples, a belonging to a place, often quite specific both materially and culturally. I am speaking today from Toronto, or Takaranto as the Haudenosaunee peoples named it, which has been the home to many Indigenous groups for over 10,000 years. I'm grateful to work on this land and seek to be in good relations with those who have taken care of it for so long. When I was an undergraduate studying philosophy and art history at the University of Toronto, admittedly a distant time when the dinosaurs were gone, but Neanderthals remained, speaking institutionally, of course, I dropped the only course in Canadian art that I had enrolled in. My considered decision at the time, the course was deadly, came back to bite me when I applied for an academic post at McGill, down the street from you, of course, in 1982. The position was in 19th century European art, my field at the time, and my prime emphasis to this day. Truly, as an afterthought in the interview, the acting chair asked something like, "Can you teach Canadian art? We need someone to cover our course." "Sure," was my response. He did not ask about my qualifications to teach in this area, assuming, as I later learned that he did, that anyone could do it. I was fortunate enough to get the job and then put into frantic practice what those of us who have academic careers know all too well, that one only truly learns a subject when teaching it. Do we still need affirmative action to promote scholarship, curating, and teaching about the art produced in this country? The answer, of course, will depend on local circumstances, but let me be hopeful in a paradoxical way and say, no more affirmative action. What you've brought together in the Guide to Studying the Visual Arts in Canada details a thriving topography, replete with resources and a diversity of approach. You see one example here of a very recent book in the field. While the visual arts and architecture of Canada must be examined in Canada, they should be, and often are, contextualized in broader and often non-national contexts. I think we can productively discuss art in Canada without suggesting that it is or needs to be somehow Canadian or made by Canadians. I hope that the study of art in Canada will be an emphasis in museum practice, research, and teaching about the Americas more generally, or if we want to be more specific, North America. I think of my own PhD supervisees, past and present, here at the University of Toronto or studying in the USA, who could readily teach local, regional, and national art in Canada in increasingly important ways precisely because their main expertise is in, for example, American or Latin American or Caribbean art. Even if we are talking about the canon of art history in Ontario, where I am, I'm encouraged by a current postdoctoral student of mine, Dr. Isabel Gapp, who is a Nordic specialist, educated in the UK, and writes on the Group of Seven in those of us trained in Canada in ways that those of us trained in Canada largely could not and do not do. We can best strengthen understandings of art in Canada by setting them in more radically comparative frameworks. That's the present and future that I want to see. I'm showing you stills from Taras Polotaiko's remarkable video, In the Land of the Headhunters from 2008, which returns us to the sensory fabric of living together in the present in ways that are inflected by history. What we see in his film is a screening of American photographer Edward Curtis's notorious 1914 silent feature film, which Polotaiko arranged for an audience of contemporary Kwakiutl people in British Columbia. Curtis's was the first feature film made in British Columbia. Akin to his rightly famous 20-volume collection of photographs called The North American Indian, published from 1907 to 1930, his original project for the film exemplifies the so-called salvage culture attitude that he and many other artists, including Emily Carr, had at this time, that Indigenous populations were in decline, would soon disappear, and thus needed to be recorded. Canceling the subjecthood of his amateur actors for the film, Curtis paid community members to act out stories and present ways of life before colonization, before his own narrative. In Politaiko's version, we see the other side of this set of issues. We see the viewers, not Curtis's film. Many of those in Politaiko's film recognized or were told about their own ancestors. Short-circuiting Curtis's dubious ethnography, Politaiko shows us a vibrant, ongoing Indigenous culture with its ghosts and its scars. When he sought financial support from the Canada Council for the project, Politaiko wrote, and I'm quoting, "My work often deals with issues of history and identity, and I have started to explore these within the British Columbia context. When I came across this movie, I immediately recognized its historic significance as well as conceptual links to my own work and interest in history, memory, erasure, colonization, and the relationship between reality and fiction." End of quotation. Coming from Ukraine, to which he has returned, and spending time in Moscow as a student and as a prisoner for evading the draft, Politaiko knows firsthand about the attempted assimilations of peoples. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I look forward to our conversations as we celebrate this wonderful publication.
It was an honor to be asked to respond to this essential guide. Thanks, Dr. Langford and Dr. Lerner, for reaching out. I'll say a few words about my teaching and research interests in contemporary diasporic artists in Canada and artists of the Middle East diasporas in particular. As I read through the guide, I was thinking primarily about how work on these artists is supported by it. In my teaching, I introduce students to the work of contemporary diasporic artists based in various Canadian cities. My Global Art History survey at York, what Dr. Christina Huneau memorably called the Pyramids to Picasso course, I undertook a funded renovation of the units on these non-European areas. The renovation is meant to add a depth and resonance to these units, which, in the assigned textbook, are treated a little flatly. In each, alongside the historical material, I include contemporary art interludes featuring the work of artists who engage in some manner with the art and histories of these areas. On the right, you see examples of works by the Toronto-based duo Life of a Craphead, the Montreal-based artists Sinia Nakvi and Jin Young Kim, and the Victoria-based artist Rick Leong. In the course, I try to set up a dialogue between the distant traditions of Asia and these artists' contemporary concerns in the age of iPhones, grunge, and gentrification, for instance. I take the same approach in my courses on Islamic art history and modern Middle Eastern art. I'll move quickly here, but these examples have been important ones in both my research and teaching. And again, it's these artists with connections to the Islamic world and or the Middle East that I had in mind as I read through the guide. Canadian art, rest in peace, succinctly describes the kind of dialogue I've followed in Elmizade's work between Sufi cosmologies, Persian miniatures, and 20th century abstract art, especially color field painting. Where Elmizade's Persian references are subtle, Noor Bishuti's works deal explicitly with the iconography of modern Jordanian art. In the middle of Gallery 44, Bishuti included a large painting by her father in a glass case. Reimagined motifs from the painting show up in the exhibition's other works, in collaged photographs of Bedouins, 3D rendered and CNC cut sculptures of livestock, delicate watercolor paintings of native Jordanian plants, and more, both a tender family history and an archaeological investigation of a moment in the history of modern Middle Eastern art. I'll finish with the Palestinian-Canadian artist Amanda Boulos's painting. I have a forthcoming article on works by Boulos that deal with the history of modern Palestinian art and with shared decolonial aims of Palestinians and Indigenous peoples of Canada through the figure of a Lebanese Sasquatch. Despite the relentless sadness of the historical traumas that Boulos reflects on in her work, a resilient sense of humor and the themes of intimacy, love, and care come across strongly. In Heart and Toll, here, a bloated symbol of love is tellingly inverted. Inside the heart shape, Boulos has included poignantly images of obsolete Palestinian coinage. As I consider how these nominally Canadian artists are to be studied, I bear in mind the importance of making non-Canadian art, cultural, and political histories of Iran, Jordan, and Palestine available to both students and researchers. The guide is a tremendous asset in this regard. The names of most all of the artists I've mentioned appear in one or another of its resources. Here is another. Jamali Hassan's art, activism, and institution building efforts in Canada since the 70s are well documented in the guide's resources. You see holdings from the Canada Council's Art Bank here in the slide. It was a thrill for me to discover, thanks to the guide, that these works, as well as a number of important publications on and by Hassan, are available just across town. I plan to spend some time at the NGC and the Art Bank in the coming months following these helpful leads. In my search through the archives section, I was pleased to see the Pier 21 Museum of Immigration in Halifax listed, a helpful reminder that I must spend some time there during my summers in Nova Scotia. That's now on the agenda for 2023. As well in this section, it was exciting to learn more about Dr. Janine Marchessault's Archive Counter-Archive project at York University. The inclusion of projects designed, as Marchessault's certainly is, to call into question the discursive boundaries of archives will be immensely important for those engaged in not just critical archival research, but in the generation of new archives. Although it wasn't included in the guide, I was reminded in this section of a collection from the MHSO, now on its way to York University, where it'll be permanently housed. This is yet another excellent resource for researchers with an interest in diasporic communities in Canada. The section on databases and indexes was also exciting. And here I was reminded of a SSHRC-funded project currently underway and led by Dr. Ming Tiempo and Ginny Yu, called tentatively the Canadian BIPOC Artists Rolodex. This will be useful for students, researchers, and especially curators engaged in augmenting our archives of Canadian art to account for the experience of equity-seeking groups. I'll conclude here with a note on what seems like a missing modern Middle East art history in our field. After noting the same gap in global art history survey texts, I wasn't entirely surprised to find that search terms for art of the modern Middle East and its diasporas led nowhere on the CAA reviews page. The region's modern art history is of course available and fascinating for those who wish to seek it out, but it could be easier. Art historians here, equipped now with a guide like this, are well positioned to write the diasporic art histories that provide such an essential point of access to this and other understudied global modernisms. I think of Dr. Alice Jim's sorely needed Journal of Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures in the Americas, and course offerings this term in my department at York, which include African Diasporic Art History and South Asian Diasporic Art History, in my own Modern Middle East Art History course. The exemplary work being done by my co-panelists as well to expand our field and make it better reflect the richness of perspectives we encounter in our classrooms and art spaces also comes to mind. This guide and the people who have worked so generously to give it to us is a sure indication of the vital place and great potential of scholarship on Canadian art in the discipline.
Art history is changing. Museums are changing. How fabulous is this? What a great moment to celebrate the Guide to Studying Visual Arts in Canada. I come from a generation when students in art history were taught, not always directly, but in more subtle ways of communication, that the highest calling was teaching in a university. Museum work was fine, but less so. Working for a gallery or an auction house was seen as going into trade, business. You could never come back from the descent into this unfortunate field to real scholarship or position in an institution. Happily, this has changed. I teach an occasional course about museums at McGill University and manage full-time the university's visual arts collection, which has an ongoing program for undergraduate and graduate student interns. They now go into teaching, working in museums, or work in commercial galleries, in auction houses, with foundations or artist-run centers, or directly with artists or even collectors. I believe we're breaking out of the old hierarchy, finally. No more judgment, work toward the career you want. I also tell students not to expect a job for life, but to accept change, embrace it. The decision you make for leaving university, the opportunities that first come your way, do not necessarily determine where you will spend your whole career. I've worked in both the US and Canada and for 5 institutions and as a guest curator at many more. What I studied is not what I write about as a scholar now. In essence, we're moving away from art history to art histories, plural. There's not one story of the history of art, but many stories. We can and we should retrieve the lost stories of artists who were marginalized, artists who did not fit the mold, whatever it was. And we're looking at more complex narratives. Tapestries, fragments of houses, edgy photographs by outsiders, they all merit our examination. It makes art history so much more interesting and complex. I love seeing how the new guide gives great information about archival resources that are so key to complexifying the stories. One of my favorite archival finds came from a box of what was left on the late gallerist Holly Solomon's desk. It was there that the information that was key to my research on the architect Gordon Matta Clark and his work with Holly. My own unscientific study of who studies art history now, based on who applies to be an intern with the Visual Arts Collection, indicates that the field is attracting an array of students who come from different backgrounds and brings so much more to what was a field that was too long dominated by people from a narrow slice of society. We need to continue to encourage all these students to join us as professionals. Finally, display. The old rule was good art belongs in a museum. At the McGill Visual Arts Collection, we have art in 90 buildings and on the grounds of 3 campuses. We don't have perfect environmental conditions everywhere, but we work to keep the art safe. Yes, it is secure, but we want it seen. Art can and should be seen by choice and also by chance, walking to class, in a conference room, or while studying in a library. Make it possible for everyone to know the art, not just from images on a screen, but in their daily lives. It's essentially a more democratic way to show art. And in the last 10 years, we've worked to broaden the range of works of art we see, including more contemporary work by Nadia Mir and Jonathan Borofsky, as well as Inuit artists, and Japanese printmakers. Years ago, I worked at a university where the best view of the campus was from a gallery in the museum building. I later gave a talk at a conference and mentioned that I had always hoped that one of the sports recruits who was regularly brought to that space would decide to study art history. Someone came up to me afterwards at the session and introduced herself. She was a hockey recruit and she'd become an art historian. I hope that we can continue to broaden who gets to see art, and even more, encourage people to take the opportunity to get to know more about what they're seeing. Thank you.
My name is Jean-Sène Bélanger, and I'm an art historian teaching and working at Bishop's University in Sherbrooke, Quebec. Since my undergrad studies, I maintain an engagement to questions of ecology and environmental philosophy in contemporary art. I'm currently working towards a publication of my doctoral thesis, which examines the renewed relationship to material production in ecological contemporary art through the lens of neo-materialist and post-humanist discourses. By establishing knowledge trajectories outside of disciplinary furrows in the humanities and science, this research brings about unusual interpretations of contemporary art and its place in the ecological understanding of the world. Since 2015, I've also taken the helm of the Forman Art Gallery at Bishop's University, and I'm dedicated since then to bring the gallery's vision and mandate to life through its programming. As a Canadian university art gallery, the Forman is a space for thinking and producing knowledge about contemporary art and its relation to the global and local communities we share. So in the context of my own curatorial practice, I've tried to conceive exhibition projects in which art acts as a prism through which we engage with other disciplinary fields. For instance, Data Aesthetics was a show that focused on a new aesthetic paradigm emerging from the ongoing revolution in data visualization. It looked at the emergence of an algorithmic sublime and how big data influences how we read the world today. Radiant Mountain pondered the legacy of modernity in alpine environments. It treated the mountain as a complex hyperobject where nature, technology, architecture, scientific research, health, spirituality, and wellness intertwine. Fabulous Images examined the scope of science fiction as a narrative genre in the context of emancipatory discourses that foster ethnocultural diversity. Intertypes looked at the cultural footprint of 3D printing in the historical and cultural continuum of printing techniques. And Parallax probed the emergence of a new astronomical sublime, informed by advances in optical and digital technologies, scientific projections, and evolving aesthetic conventions in the field of astrophysics. This exhibition was the occasion to establish a partnership with the Astrolabe du Mont Mégantic in the organization of a roundtable on the subject of visual culture. This event allowed us to initiate a conversation between two astrophysicists and two artists in the hope of deciphering how their respective methodologies could potentially inform one another. So this is but one example of our efforts to integrate our programming into the academic mission of the university. We also make concerted efforts to expand the curatorial voice of our guest curators. So for instance, in the context of the exhibition Les Yeux dans l'eau, guest curator Geneviève Wallen maintained a blog for about a year in which she expanded the ideas she initiated in the context of the show. This here is one example of her posts. She also orchestrated a playlist project asking everyone involved, so the gallery team and the artists, to select musical scores that connect them to the theme of the exhibition. And this brings me to speak about our community art lab. The Art Lab positions itself on the cutting edge between art, education, and community development, with the goal of exploring how these worlds collide and interact with one another. Among its many endeavors is the pop-up exhibition series, which presents the traces of research and creative projects carried out by Bishop's University's student body and faculty. Following the principles of community-based museology and micromuseology, these art events are often collective, participatory, and experimental in nature. For instance, this particular project titled Adaptation connected fine arts students with biology students in an exercise of evolutionary speculation. So they imagined the future of the evolution of species in response to climate change, and fine arts students were invited to illustrate these fictive future beings. And so at last but not least, all of this is carried within a robustly bilingual environment. En tant qu'historienne de l'art francophone qui travaille au sein d'une institution anglophone, c'est vraiment très important pour moi de créer un espace pour que la discipline puisse se développer en dehors des silos linguistiques. Je pense que c'est crucial que les concepts, les notions et les idées qui sont développées au sein de la discipline puissent migrer d'une langue à l'autre. Plusieurs initiatives travaillent présentement dans cette direction. On peut penser notamment au programme de doctorat en histoire de l'art à Montréal qui est structuré sur un mode interuniversitaire et donc qui regroupe des étudiants et des membres facultaires de Concordia, de l'Université de Montréal et de l'UQAM. Il y a aussi l'UQAGAC, les University and College Art Galleries Association of Canada, qui font vraiment des efforts concertés pour susciter une grande collégialité entre les institutions francophones et anglophones. Alors, c'est vraiment... je pense que c'est vraiment crucial qu'on demeure ambitieux par rapport à ce projet de bilinguisme, mais qu'on vise plus encore en prenant une responsabilité personnelle pour développer des notions de base dans une troisième langue, c'est-à-dire dans la langue autochtone de nos territoires respectifs. Pour ma part, je vis et je travaille sur le territoire non cédé de la nation Wabanaki, et donc c'est important pour moi d'envisager dans le futur de prendre des cours d'Abenaki, ne serait-ce que pour pouvoir saluer et accueillir vraiment correctement tous mes publics. Alors voilà, merci beaucoup. J'ai bien hâte de poursuivre la conversation.
My work in the field of Canadian art history owes a debt of gratitude to Indigenous, Black, people of color, as well as white settler artists, cultural workers, curators, and scholars whose determination and labor in asserting Indigenous sovereignties, decolonization, resurgence, self-representation, and racial justice has laid substantial foundations and established meshworks of care, relationality, rigor, and visions over time. Today, I'm going to discuss this idea of towards a model of co-resistance, decolonial Canadian art histories. And in this, I think about the academic, artistic, and activist reflections, refusals, and reckonings that I have learned from and been in conversation with, which have informed the ways in which I work as an art historian, an educator, and a curator, and also are the reasons why I can do the work I do and the ways I do it. Spanning decades, much of this artistic and academic labor has inspired, challenged, and supported researchers and practitioners, such as myself, working across arts and cultural sectors to chart decolonial, anti-racist, and collaborative paths forward. From this ongoing learning and unlearning, it is clear that the field of Canadian art history can mobilize these foundations to further activate and realize equity-based futurities that dismantle and refuse settler colonial logics of white supremacy, possession, and extractivism. I currently live on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Mi'kmaq Nation as an uninvited guest, territories upon which over 10 years I have developed collaborative and decolonial methodologies and approaches towards academic and artistic partnerships, as well as aim to mobilize white settler responsibilities to include treaty relations and working in Indigenous sovereignties. Ultimately, I have and continue to be incredibly privileged to work towards contributing arts-led research methodologies that underscore the role of art and transdisciplinary art historical research for mobilizing decolonizing futures. A part of that collective work includes the centering of histories, previously marginalized, and their attempted erasures from Canadian art history, such as Indigenous art histories, that we see examples here, Black art histories, queer art histories, amongst many others. An additional part of this work is the unsettling of current art historical models and methodologies. Although I cannot attend to the extensive role and roles that the Diachronic Project Art and Art History have played in the formation of nationalist narratives, it is important to note the ongoing role cultural, production, institutions, and the industry as well as individual artists, curators, academics have played in both the maintenance as well as the resistance and decolonization of settler colonial logics. Many artists who make work concerning Indigenous sovereignty, for instance, in the context of the lands we now call Canada, visualize and perform theory for embodying ways of being and knowing based on their distinct lived experience, commitments, and positionality. My experience in the field is grounded in constellations of colleagues and collaborators committed to concepts of relational, decolonial care and change, aiming to activate collaborative art-led art historical research, to activate decolonizing, and in my case specifically, intergenerational white settler responsibility, among other focuses. Fundamental questions that inform much of the present research in Canadian art history that aims to produce what I would say is research for and not about include: who does this research benefit? What is my role as an art historian or a curator? Why am I participating and leading this work? The opportunity to reflect about future Canadian art histories or models and frameworks from which we can build and grow the field anew must always bring forward the innovative and radical work of previous generations of academics and artists, those trailblazers whose shoulders we stand upon. From here, we can future dream the practices we wish we had as our younger selves, or potentially our current selves, and for those who come after us. What are those models for you? This incredible resource highlights much of the past and current work that provides many productive examples from which we can continue to build and grow the field anew. Questions framing our shared present and future practices that I consider on a daily basis include: who is missing? This question is not new, and we've all been asking it, but really it is still very relevant and calls attention to the ongoing work of building Canadian art histories that address historic absences, institutional exclusions, and the epistemic violence of producing and maintaining canonical knowledges. How can we write, curate, and build art histories for future colleagues and present students that are grounded in these particular conversations, projects, and initiatives? And who should be leading them? Whose land are we making, writing, teaching, and curating and researching on? What are my responsibilities based on my personal subject positionalities as an art historian, curator, researcher in relation to Indigenous sovereignty, settler colonialism, and white supremacy? What does Canadian art history look like, grounded in Indigenous sovereignty and anti-racist methodology? In other words, the future of Canadian art history must attend to and grow from conceptualizing and mobilizing frameworks that activate the ongoingness of sovereign Indigenous land and territories and treaty responsibilities, to include with non-humans, land, water, animals, in order to embody decoloniality, meaning to advance parallel and intersecting critical settler, anti-racist, queer, Black, POC, and Indigenous methodologies that critique and resist colonial power structures. It is necessary to invoke multivocal approaches that honor, respond to, and activate relationships of trust, reciprocity, respect, responsibility, and accountability. In all of this work, foundational questions that must be consistently and continually asked is: what is Canadian art history's relationship to Indigenous sovereignty, white supremacy, and the colonial project? And how do I benefit, or how do I not benefit from settler colonial structures? And what is my place within them? How can ethical decolonial methodologies be activated to engender real transformation that challenges white supremacy, white privilege, and white fragility, and promotes Indigenous sovereign futurity? And further, how can a field of research such as Canadian art history as a settler nation discipline and a discourse move beyond consumptive and appropriative practices toward an embodiment of decoloniality and a role of accomplice in unsettling possessive forms of research? These are some of the questions I asked myself as a white settler scholar in the course of working on collaborative projects with Indigenous artists, curators, and scholars, unsettling Canadian art history, as well as arts-based initiatives that critique settler colonialism. Fundamentally, future Canadian art histories can and must embody Indigenous sovereignties as a framework that attend to host and guest protocols to support the writing and sharing of multifocal histories of self-determined artistic production, curation, and research. The models of writing, building relational, multivocal, and decolonial art histories in the context of Canadian art histories that connect the local, the national, and the global, while always already being in Indigenous sovereignty are already present in the field and provide frameworks from which to further and expand upon. In alignment with many Indigenous as well as Black and POC thinkers, artists, activists, there is an obligation for white-dominant settler institutions, discourses, and white settler subjects to participating in decolonizing and unsettling colonial structures that continue to perpetuate the settler colonial order and its unbalanced environments of representational and epistemic violence. With all this in mind, with the opportunity to dream and think in terms of the future of Canadian art history, it is also imperative to further advance mentorship of future colleagues, of students, by modeling sustainable and hopefully joyful working practices that support us, meaning those working in the field of Canadian art history as human beings, to move into spaces where we, our research, and our communities can thrive and grow together. Thank you.
Tan Chikiwao, Kathy Mattis Dishnakashan, Niam Mitchif, Spruce Woods, Manitoba, Nuikin. I identify as Southwestern Manitoba Michif. I'm an art history professor currently teaching at the University of Winnipeg. I teach art history and in the graduate curatorial practicum program. I am also a beadworker, freelance curator, and writer. And it's such a privilege for me to share a little bit in this video. I wanted to start off by sharing these three photos. I'm a graduate of Concordia University. I received my MA in art history there in 1998. The image on the left is me with a sculpture that I wrote about. And it's a sculpture of Louis Riel, and my thesis was considering images of Louis Riel and Métis nationhood. The two other images, the center one is of my auntie Jean Barron Ward, my mom's sister, who was my first beadwork teacher. And when I graduated from Concordia, a couple days before I was to fly out for convocation, she decided to make this quilt and gift it to Dr. Joan Ackland, who was my MA thesis supervisor. And that's a picture of the two of us together at convocation. And it was really sweet. I think one reason why my auntie Jean did it was she recognized the impact and the work that Dr. Joan Ackland did with me that was also for my family. But she also recognized that she was also my teacher, my educator, and guided me in all sorts of ways through beadwork and discussions around the kitchen table, which is very much centered in my curatorial and art history work today. And I'm so grateful to both of these women and the work that they did with me back then. I've had the privilege to curate in organizations of all different sizes, including the Winnipeg Art Gallery, and I've done lots of work with Urban Shaman Gallery. And when I was young, shortly after I finished my master's, I had opportunities to do some real grassroots curatorial work with Urban Shaman Gallery and the Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba, a mid-sized gallery that I got to work with. I started teaching full-time at Brandon University in the Department of Visual Arts in 2008. It's the longest running Indigenous visual arts degree program in Canada. It started as a program in the late 70s, early 1980s by artists, including Colleen Cutchell, a Lakota artist and art historian and educator. It was one of the earliest programs that offered Indigenous art history courses on a regular basis. Even though I had access to that, I chose to go study at Concordia University to finish off my art history degree, learn Indigenous art history from Joan Ackland, and then move on to do a master's there. Here is another project that I did. I've always been interested in doing large but in small locations. So Frontrunners was a multi-exhibition project that included a host organization and lots of involvement with family members, the artists, and community to make sure we could properly honor and welcome home PINA, or the Professional Native Indian Artists, Inc. Creating and activating sites for gathering and relationship making has been central to my curatorial practice and with how I teach art history and curatorial studies. And responding to requests and needs from community has been really key. And part of relationship making for Frontrunners was reaching out to family members and those who were close to some of the artists in Pina and making sure they felt welcome and honored the way that we were honoring their loved ones who were the artists who were part of Pina. Through the time, I've been really lucky to continue to curate exhibitions where I get to learn more about contemporary and historic art by Indigenous artists, but also really consider how I walk this earth as a Michif woman from southwestern Manitoba. More recently, I got to co-curate an exhibition called Kwatanitawakik at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. My co-curator was Sherry Farrell-Rosette. Kwatanitawakik in Southern Michif means a hard birth, and the name was gifted to us by Verna de Montigny. And it was a great opportunity to further relationship making, develop understandings, and ensure that there were critical conversations about the role that Michif women and non-binary folks played in the creation of the province of Manitoba, which was instigated by the Métis Nation. Activating arts and engagement and activating the spaces that we had the privilege of working with at the Winnipeg Art Gallery was really important to Sherry Farrell-Rosette and I. So from these images, you can see we had slingshot making, fiddle jams, we had beading sessions, and we also had fish scale art making as well with Michif artist Erin Consmo. And more recently, I've had the privilege to co-curate this exhibition, Radical Stitch, with Sherry Farrell-Rosette again, and Michelle Lavallee, an Anishinaabe curator. And this exhibition is touring around Canada right now and is considered to be the largest exhibition of contemporary Indigenous art featuring artists from Turtle Island, or what's now known as North America. So there's been lots of shifts that have happened since I started way back in 1998. When I think about what the expectations that I have now for our changing field, I think it is we need to work collectively to recognize ongoing fragility due to galleries, museums, and academic institutions being colonial ventures. We need to be tributaries, because if we aren't, the doors continue to only open for some, only to a certain extent, and for specific reasons that don't always correlate with our goals, and those we are accountable to. Jim Logan, who's a Métis Cree artist, once said that at one point we were yelling outside the walls, but now we yell within. But if there isn't a larger and diversified chorus, then ultimately we contribute or even uphold the same institutions that did their best to keep us out. So I think for me, expectations moving forward are to ensure there's deeper dives into art curation and art historical practices that cast a wider net and ensures that direction is taken from those most impacted by exclusionary Western art history and curatorial practices. Merci pour ton temps. Thank you very much.
Having relocated from Montreal to Toronto in 2010 and from Toronto to Vancouver in 2017, I've experienced how certain Canadian art historical and visual cultural milestones don't always translate in terms of impact when removed from their cultural location. When I expressed to my Vancouver students fervor over the aesthetic dimensions and impact of seeing a city swathed in red during the 2012 Quebec student movement, or a student tells me about the ambivalence of inhabitants of Vancouver's East Vancouver neighborhoods about Ken Lum's monument to East Vancouver, we are also telling stories about our unique affective attachments to place that are more difficult to convey. What does a student studying in Vancouver gain from learning about the Refus Global and the Quiet Revolution? How can a student in Montreal make sense of why the Gastown riots would become the historical topic of Stan Douglas's prominent photographic installation, Abbott and Cordova, 7 August 1971, in downtown Vancouver? How do we make sense of place, and how do we make place make sense across a continent of difference? Featuring prominently in the 2016 exhibition Form Follows Function, Art and Artists in Toronto, curated by Toronto-based artist and inveterate historian of Toronto art histories, Louis Jacob, the late Canadian conceptual artist Gordon Lebret's 1974 addendum, comprised of electrical tape and letraset spelling out the phrase, "Get hold of this space," was applied to the wall. The work simultaneously imposes a border and forces a consideration of the space it's in, not just the gallery. I note the work's appearance in Jacob's exhibition due to the exhibition's focus on a specific place, Toronto, Canada, and the modes through which artists like Jacob not only engage with, but also inform a notion of a specific place. Jacob's approach included the organization of over 100 works into 4 categories: mapping, modeling, performing, and congregating. But the works included in the exhibition were not about Toronto per se. Rather, they provided more subtle allegorical cues for audiences to access a sense of place via the specific urgencies and preoccupations of a group of artists over the course of 50 years. The longer I engage with the discipline we are calling Canadian art history, the more times I crisscross around the country or else attempt to teach and promote Canadian art history as not only an exciting field of study, but a productive one for students trying to make sense of their own situatedness in the place they're in, the less clear I am on the delineations of the category. Urgencies surrounding Indigenous land claims and reconciliation, as well as critical thinking around and activist rearticulations of national borders, have corroded formerly rigid definitions of nation, citizenship, land, country, and border, allowing for more marginalized histories to come to the fore. A cultural imaginary positioning Canada as a vacant lot, albeit one of many vacant lots, is notably articulated in the 2014 edited volume, Negotiations in a Vacant Lot, Studying the Visual in Canada, in which the authors argue at once for the cultural specificity of the national discipline of Canadian art history as built out by state support, and for the increasingly contentious formulation of a view to a national art history in an era of globalization and a view to the arbitrariness of state-defined borders. In the early 2010s, language around visual art ecologies became prominent, as in the Canada Council report, The Distinct Role of Artist-Run Centres in Visual Arts Ecology, and from 2012, and in 2013, The Ecology of an Art Scene, which was a symposium organized in Toronto in collaboration between the Power Plant, the Canadian Art Foundation International Speaker Series, and the Consulat Général of France, which, quote, recognized that art ecologies are composed of dynamically interacting parts, including a multitude of practices, subjectivities, and institutions, the communities they create, and the economies they rely upon, deviate from, or invent, end quote. This echoes what in the 2009 edited volume Communities of Sense, Rethinking Aesthetics and Politics, Jacques Ancière writes, quote, I do not take the phrase community of sense to mean a collectivity shaped by some common feeling. I understand it as a frame of visibility and intelligibility that puts things or practices together under the same meaning, which shapes thereby a certain sense of community, end quote. The researching and writing of Canadian art history increasingly echoes a refusal of singularity that has long been ingrained in Canada's on-the-ground collectives, artist-run centres, and region-specific art scenes, and toward collaborative scholarly endeavours. Within these initiatives, Canada's art history of collaboration is joined by an ethics of consultation because, to my mind, as with the material partitions that are also symbolic partitions in the gallery, they index and draw together communities of difference, or drawing from the queer anti-relational turn, a notion of building Canadian art histories apart together. We might think about this in relation to our teaching as well, where the classroom, to my mind, is not a de facto community. The only given thing we as students and educators necessarily share in common is the room that brings us together. At a time in Canada when artists, art historians, and art institutions are at once critically examining and posing alternatives to dominant art world structures around issues including institutional colonialism, racism, sexism, and homophobia, wage structures and precarious labor, and complicity in gentrification. A close examination of the structuring principle of art and art ecologies from physical space, such as institutions, to artistic praxis is urgently needed. What material, social, cultural, and political conditions have resulted in the art ecologies which we now inhabit? How might the histories of institutional structures and structural organization within Canada's art ecologies help us to articulate the kinds of structural change we want in our imaginings of how these ecologies might unfold differently moving forward? How do we not only engage the communities that inform our research, but also take a clear and honest view to the role of Canadian art history and art historians, not merely as observers of the art and culture that takes place across this land, but as deeply implicated within Canada's art ecologies?
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to join you in celebrating the launch of the Guide to Studying the Visual Arts in Canada. I want to congratulate Shannon and Lauren on this comprehensive, inclusive volume that will serve our discipline very well. My name is Dr. Cynthia Hammond. In addition to teaching architectural history in Concordia's Department of Art History, I have a parallel life as an artist, which is closely tied to my interest in women's spatial stories. As a painter, I draw from archival materials and cite research. The resulting images are not so much factual records of the past as they are suggestive thresholds to the historic spaces created by women, particularly gardens. On screen is a painting I made while artist in residence at the Colby Curtis Museum in Stansted, Quebec. And this coming April, I will be artist in residence at La Napoule Art Foundation in France, which I'm thrilled about. When I have the privilege to work as an artist in residence, I always engage with the situated or emplaced knowledge of those who care for the buildings and gardens that I'm visiting. And it's precisely this kind of situated knowledge that I want to talk about in relation to the new Guide to Studying the Visual Arts in Canada. The guide has a 10-page section on oral history and interviews, which includes technical and ethical considerations, as well as advice on data management. I was honored to revise this segment of the guide for the new edition. And to do so, I drew upon 3 years of co-directing Concordia's Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling, as well as courses that I've designed around the living memories of artists, architects, and other cultural workers. I also drew from several oral history projects that I've led, the largest being La Ville Extraordinaire, a SSHRC partnership development project that asks, what can we learn about the city by listening to diverse older residents? This project repositions the architecture of Montreal from the perspective of individuals who have not yet been fully heard within architectural history, urban planning, and heritage. To this end, we have gathered over 150 interviews with older members of Montreal's Haitian, Chinese, Filipino, activist, and working class communities. We also have a significant number of interviews with former sex workers who have incredible urban knowledge. These spatial stories are the heart of our project, and key to this have been the relationships that our student researchers have established with different communities. Whenever possible, we've hired students who are part of the community in question. And you see here, for example, on the right, Cassie Tellier-Charles, an MA student in art history at Concordia, interviewing Charles Botex, and both are members of the Haitian Montreal community. La Ville Extraordinaire's major outcome will be an exhibition at Le Centre des Mémoires Montréalaises, a new museum, in fall 2023. The exhibition will choreograph our interviews through several mapping strategies. Our digital mapping platform, for example, designed by my colleague in geography, Dr. Sébastien Capcar, allows us to precisely geolocate our interviewees' memories. It also permits us to cross-reference these memories through 15 themes, including gender, activism, racialized experience, community identification, and so on. And here you see just 8 interviewees' stories cross-referenced on the theme of belonging. So you can imagine how rich the final mapping will be. How has this project been received by our interviewees so far? Wendy Allen, for example, shared with me that for her, quote, the project has been a gift. It kept me active and involved through the dark days of the pandemic, end quote. And the project has been meaningful for our student researchers too. Vanessa Sikat, doctoral candidate in art history, reflected upon her interview with a housing and childcare activist. It is because of Sarah Humphrey, Vanessa says, that I got to attend daycare and grow up in a co-op with a single working mother. It is because of Sarah Humphrey that I had the childhood I had. What an honor it was to meet her, end quote. In a project whose timeline extends beyond the average length of a master's degree, we have seen some coming and going within the team, but every member has received extensive oral history training in precisely the methods laid out in the Guide to Studying the Visual Arts in Canada. Beyond connecting different communities with Concordia's research culture and training a new generation of art historians, it's important to ask what benefits such research brings to our discipline. For me, a historian of the built environment, the benefits are significant. For example, our project has brought us close to the history and architecture of the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal. McGill University now seeks to transform this complex into an interdisciplinary research hub that will shift the former focus on, quote, healing the body to a new McGill University campus focused on healing the planet, end quote. Through La Ville Extraordinaire, however, I came to meet the Kanien'kehá:ka Kanistansara, or Mohawk mothers, a group of largely older Indigenous women. These women have taken McGill to court, fighting to ensure that the hospital's redevelopment be an Indigenous-led process. The Kanistansara claimed that the site was used as an unmarked grave for Indigenous and other children during the notorious MK Ultra years when the hospital received funding from the CIA to undertake mind control experiments. McGill has long denied any wrongdoing, but the Kanistansara have evidence to the contrary. And here you see the women presenting their side of the story at an event sponsored by La Ville Extraordinaire on International Women's Day this year. Bringing lesser heard stories to wider attention is precisely what oral history can do. It is significant to me that the Kanistansara themselves believe in this method, as evidenced by their 2022 book, Mohawk Warrior Nation, which presents Kanien'kehá:ka art history and political history through oral histories. Oral history provides art history with an important set of tools to make palpable, that is, to make heard, to make felt, that which is not already visible in the work of art or architecture. With such voices guiding us, we can see buildings like the Royal Vic not simply in terms of architecture or heritage, but instead as a powerful site where more inclusive urban histories could take place. These histories, I hope, will make for more inclusive and thus vital urban futures as well. Please follow us on Instagram or Facebook and join us in September for our big opening at the Centre des Mémoires Montréalaises. Thank you very much. And again, my warmest congratulations to Lauren and Shannon for their marvelous gift to our discipline.
There's a few things that got me thinking about growing the field of Canadian art histories. And the first was in 2017 when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Jaroslawski Institute. And I was charged with creating a better understanding of the state of Canadian art histories in university departments across Canada. Now, it's a complicated discipline shaped by histories of regionalism, language, colonialism, diaspora. And of course, this is all compounded by the physical distances between institutions and resources. So of course, the first thing I did was create a tandem Google Map spreadsheet. But in my investigation, I also wanted to move outside of the departmental box. So I met not only with instructors and department chairs on my university visits, but also university gallery directors, university librarians, and archivists. And in all of my meetings, I ended with kind of a really optimistic question. I wanted to know, what they considered to be a dream resource that they'd like to see to help them enrich their Canadian-focused courses. Now, some of the answers were really whimsical, like a jet to fly students to museums all across Canada. But I think what every single answer had in common, and what my report tried to encapsulate, was that everybody really wanted connectivity. We wanted to know what was happening on the other side of the country. We wanted not just to be able to connect with them in terms of research, but we also wanted to be able to connect in terms of teaching, right? To share that connectivity with our students. So I created this report. It outlined my kind of methods, my findings, and also made a few suggestions as to how we could increase our connectivity, how we could network our networks. And then, of course, the pandemic happened in 2020, which brought along with it immense isolation, but also this new kind of attention to connectivity and also to accessibility. In this kind of odd silver lining, we centered ways to connect and communicate in ways that not only broke down distance, but also, enabled real-time conversations to be captioned and translated, enabled caregivers and people with disability to be present for conversations in a way that they might not have been before. And also, and I think most importantly, it enabled us to really co-create in dynamic new ways. Now, I want to talk about two initiatives that I've been a part of that are utilizing connectivity as a way to grow the discipline of Canadian art studies. The first is Knowledge and Networks Quarterly. It's a bulletin that draws together activities in Canadian art studies, and like most bulletins, it provides a roundup and a glimpse into interesting things that are happening across the field, but it has an added focus of highlighting events, ideas, and initiatives that are themselves connective and that advance accessibility within teaching and research. And there's been so much in the last few years. The bulletin's been alive for 2 years now, and there's been so many new and free accessible courses, seminars, workshops, workbooks, professional development opportunities. And there's also been so much writing and introspection on the field itself, particularly through the lens of accessibility, which I take in this kind of twofold way. Actual access through the elimination of virtual and physical barriers, but also accessibility in a kind of generative way that enables us to think, talk, and connect together across experiences and knowledges. And so the bulletin really highlights this. The second initiative that I've been a part of is one example of many efforts to kind of practice what we preach. So myself and 5 others, Joanna Amos, Alina Buis, Jen Kennedy, Devin Smither, and Sarah E.K. Smith, are part of a teaching collective called Open Art Histories. And we were inspired by the idea that changes within the discipline needed to be matched by transformations in the ways that we teach. And this group looks specifically towards open educational resources and practice. So the creation of tools that are not just free, but are also adaptable, reusable, remixable. And we see these tools as a way to foster not just connectivity within the discipline, but as a way to co-create knowledge. In 2021, we launched Canada Art Histories. We knew that instructors were looking for alternatives beyond the kind of standard course pack and textbooks as a way to break apart and challenge the canonical nature of the discipline in their course design and in pedagogical practice. And we saw open platforms as an opportunity for disrupting narratives. So Canada Art Histories is an online course and an open learning object that includes contributor-based text, provides a customizable and remixable set of resources for understanding the diverse histories of art in Canada. And our aims were twofold. The first was to broaden the definition of Canadian art in relation to emerging conversations around decolonization, equity and inclusion, and internationalization. And the second was to develop a novel and flexible online course, ensuring that the content was broadly accessible and sustainable. Now, if I think back to that initial question that I was asking people on my departmental visits in 2017 about dream resources, it's efforts like these that center accessibility and that center multivocality and a variety of knowledges and understandings within the discipline that I see not just as shaping the future of the field, but being the very vehicles on which these connections can actually take shape.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shannon Stride, and I'm the co-editor, along with Professor Lauren Lerner, of the Guide to Studying the Visual Arts in Canada. And I am so honored to be welcoming you today to our virtual launch. Professor Lerner brought me onto this project in 2020 with the task of updating Concordia's website titled Researching the Visual Arts in Canada. Lauren and I got on like a house on fire, and this project quickly expanded, eventually becoming the over 500-page open education resource guidebook that we are celebrating today. I would like to thank the many people who contributed to this guidebook, namely Martha Langford and Brenda Dion from the Gale and Stephen A. Jarosławski Institute for Canadian Art for their unfailing support as this project grew. Cynthia Hammond for generously providing such detailed information on the field of oral history and its role in Canadian art histories. Our editorial board under the leadership of Jean Latour for their care and diligence in reviewing our work, and Pata Macedo for her beautiful design of this guidebook. Lastly, I must express my deep gratitude to Lauren Lerner herself. Her tireless commitment to expanding Canadian art histories and creating online resources in our field is an inspiration. Without her consistent guidance, tutelage, unparalleled knowledge, and encouragement, this project would never have existed. I would and could say much more about Lauren, but she told me that she would be upset if I talked about her too much in this opening speech, so I'll stop there. She did insist that I remind listeners today that the Guide to Studying the Visual Arts in Canada is a snapshot of the field at this moment, and that we recognize that new resources are constantly being produced, and for this reason, we will update the guide every 2 years. We encourage readers to send relevant updates and information to Lauren directly. One can find her contact information in the introduction to the guide. So that's it from me for now. I look forward to our discussion, and I'm deeply grateful for playing a role in this project. Thank you so much for joining in.